Have you ever wondered what people do when they think no one's watching? Tonight, a millionaire decides to test his maid by pretending to sleep, but what he sees next will freeze him to the core. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? Charleston Bay lay still that morning, the kind of quiet that pressed softly against the windows and whispered through the halls of the Calloway mansion. The tide was low, and the old wooden dock creaked as gulls drifted over the gray-blue water. Inside, Ethan Calloway stood by the window of his study, watching the horizon with the detached calm of a man who had long since forgotten what hope felt like. The clock on the wall ticked faithfully, steady, unbothered, and alone, much like him. He poured himself coffee from a silver pot that had once belonged to his mother. The aroma filled the room, yet somehow it made him lonelier. He had built an empire on precision and distance, a life measured in quarterly reports and property values. Yet each morning arrived the same, the echo of footsteps that never came, the warmth that never returned. A photograph sat on the corner of his desk, his mother's smiling face beside a younger version of himself. He turned it face down. The mansion was spotless, silent, and cold. Even the ocean breeze that slipped through the open window seemed hesitant to disturb the perfection. His employees came and went quietly, afraid of the man who never raised his voice but froze the room with a glance. They called him Mr. Calloway, Sir always with that pause, the one that carried fear disguised as respect. Outside, a pickup truck rattled up the gravel driveway. Ethan frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. The agency had promised a new housekeeper would arrive today, but he had forgotten her name already. He disliked interviews, especially those that reminded him of the world beyond his carefully built walls. He took another sip of coffee as the doorbell rang. It echoed through the vast house, bouncing off marble and glass like a polite intrusion. He waited a moment before answering, letting the silence stretch. Then he opened the door. Standing there was a woman in her early 30s, her brown hair tied neatly back, her posture careful but not timid. She held a folder and wore a light blue blouse, the kind of shade that caught sunlight. The faint scent of lemon drifted toward him, clean, simple, alive. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she said, offering a small smile. "Grace Moreno, from Charleston Home Services. You requested assistance 3 days a week." Ethan's gaze flicked over her resume without interest. "Yes. You're early." "I find it helps," she replied, not lowering her eyes. "Especially with people who value time." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not yet. "Follow me," he said. They walked through the long hallway, lined with family portraits, men and women in oil paint, all wearing the same restrained expressions. Grace paused before one. "Beautiful home," she said softly. "Feels quiet." He ignored the comment. "You'll find the cleaning supplies in the pantry. Start wherever you wish. Just don't disturb the study." "Understood." He left her in the hallway, pretending to read a financial report, though his mind had wandered. There was something unsettling about her presence, not threatening, just unfamiliar. The sound of running water from the kitchen broke the stillness. Then, faintly, a hum. Grace was humming, low and sweet, like someone who found comfort in her work. It filled the corners of the mansion that had forgotten what human warmth sounded like. Ethan set down his pen. He didn't remember the last time someone had dared to hum under his roof. By noon, the scent of lemon and soap had replaced the usual sterile air. Grace moved with calm efficiency, dusting the bookshelves, wiping the glass doors that looked out toward the bay. At one point, she paused near the study door, peering at the framed photo still turned face down. She didn't touch it, but her reflection appeared faintly in the glass above his mother's face. When Ethan stepped out later, she straightened quickly. "I was just working," he finished for her, his tone neutral. "That's what you're paid for." Grace nodded, unbothered. "Would you like me to prepare lunch before I leave?" He hesitated. "That won't be necessary." "All right," she said, gathering her things. But as she walked toward the door, she added gently, "Sir, if you ever want the place to smell less like money and more like a home, open your windows a little more. The sea air helps." He blinked, unsure how to respond. Then she was gone, leaving the faint trace of lemon behind, lingering longer than she did. That night, the clock ticked on. The ocean sighed against the shore. and for the first time in months, Ethan opened a window before turning off the light. The night crept in slowly, wrapping the bay in velvet blue. Ethan sat in his study again, a single lamp glowing over the dark oak desk. The sound of the waves outside came steady, soft against the pilings. He tried to read, but the words blurred together. Contracts, numbers, investments. None of it seemed to hold weight the way it used to. His eyes drifted toward the hallway where the faintest smell of lemon still lingered. He didn't understand why it unsettled him. Maybe because it reminded him of life simple, domestic life, something he had carefully erased. For years, this house had existed like a museum, untouched by laughter or light. Yet one afternoon with that humming woman had changed its rhythm. He stood, walking toward the kitchen without knowing why. The room looked different now, as though someone had exhaled warmth into it. The counter gleamed. The old brass kettle she must have used sat drying by the sink. Next to it, tucked against the wall, a small note, written in neat handwriting, caught his eye. The silver vase on the mantel has a crack, but it's still beautiful. Thought you'd want to know. No signature. Just her careful words. Ethan lifted his gaze to the mantel, where the vase his mother's reflected the lamplight. A hairline crack ran down one side, barely visible. He'd never noticed it before. Or maybe he had, and chosen to ignore it, like everything else that hinted at imperfection. He touched the rim with his fingers. It was cool and smooth, but something inside him shifted a flicker of awareness that not everything broken needed replacing. Some things just needed care. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. The bay shimmered under the moonlight, silver and alive. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of salt and lemon. When he turned back to his desk, he noticed the photograph lying face down. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted it and set it upright. His mother's smile stared back, gentle, kind, the sort of smile that had once made the world less sharp. He didn't smile in return, not yet, but something inside him eased. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times. Its echo lingered long after, marking time in a way that felt different tonight, less like a reminder, more like a heartbeat. He sat once more at his desk, the vase glinting faintly from across the room. Outside, the tide rolled in again, carrying whispers from the bay. And though he would never admit it out loud, Ethan Calloway stayed awake longer than usual that night, listening to the rain, to the sea, to the quiet that for the first time in years did not feel like loneliness. That night, the clock ticked softly. The sea breathed against the shore, and the faint scent of lemon lingered in the air. That night, the clock ticked softly. The sea breathed against the shore, and the faint scent of lemon lingered in the air. Morning light spilled across the bay, soft and golden, turning the water into sheets of rippling glass. Ethan Calloway stood at the window again, coffee in hand, staring out as if the horizon might offer answers. The scent of the sea was sharper after last night's rain, mingling faintly with something that didn't belong here, lemon, again. It clung to the drapes, to the polished wood, as if refusing to leave. He told himself it was trivial, just cleaning products, nothing more. Yet when he walked through the hall, he noticed the air didn't feel as heavy. The silence had changed. It no longer pressed against his chest. It waited, expectant, almost gentle. A knock came from the front door. He hesitated, then opened it. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," Grace said, standing there with the same careful smile, a small bag of supplies over her shoulder. The sunlight caught the edges of her hair, giving it a faint halo. "You're early again," he said. "Habit," she replied. "And I figured the sea breeze doesn't dust itself." Ethan stepped aside. "You may begin." Grace entered quietly, setting her bag down near the pantry. She moved with the calm confidence of someone used to being invisible, yet dignified enough not to seem small. The faint hum returned soft, tuneful, unbothered by his presence. Ethan tried to focus on the newspaper, but his attention drifted. He could hear her footsteps, the clink of glass, the rhythm of her work. There was something steady about her movements, as if she carried her own peace wherever she went. At noon, he found her in the kitchen, arranging flowers in a simple vase, wild daisies, and bits of bay grass she must have gathered from outside. "You don't need to decorate," he said, more brusquely than intended. She glanced up, unoffended. It's not decoration, it's life. Houses forget their homes when nobody reminds them. He stared at her for a moment. Do they teach you that at the agency? Grace laughed softly. No, sir. The agency teaches mopping and dusting. My grandmother taught me the rest. Something in her tone, firm, yet kind, unsettled him again. She reminded him of the way his mother used to speak, never demanding, simply there. Do you always talk so much while you work? He asked. Only when silence feels too loud. He didn't reply. But when she turned away, he found himself watching the light move across her shoulders, the easy grace of her motions. There was no pretense in her, no attempt to please or impress, just presence. After lunch, Grace wiped her hands and asked if he'd like her to handle the pantry shelves. Do what you think necessary, he said. Everything's necessary to someone, she murmured, almost to herself. He almost smiled. Almost. That afternoon, Ethan tried to retreat to his office, but the sound of laughter drifted from the backyard, unexpected, light, almost musical. He followed the sound through the open door and saw Grace kneeling by the garden fence, coaxing a stray cat with a saucer of milk. It's been wandering around since yesterday, she said without looking back. Guess it likes the smell of lemons, too. Ethan folded his arms. You're not paid to feed strays. She shrugged. Then consider it a bonus act of kindness. He should have told her to stop. But when the small gray cat rubbed against her hand and purred, something inside him, tight, invisible, loosened just a bit. You'll spoil it, he said quietly. Grace smiled. Maybe it needs spoiling. She stood and brushed her hands against her jeans, turning toward him. You ever keep pets, Mr. Calloway? No. Not even when you were a kid? He hesitated. Didn't have time for animals. Emmy. Grace tilted her head, studying him for a moment, then nodded. Maybe it's time you do. He looked away toward the bay. Maybe it's time you finished your shift, he said evenly, though there was no bite in his tone. Grace gathered her things without protest. Before she left, she placed a small lemon slice in the cat's bowl just for scent, she said. He didn't understand it, but the gesture stayed in his mind long after the door closed. That night, when he walked past the kitchen, he noticed the stray curled up under the table, sleeping soundly. He didn't chase it out. Ethan woke before dawn the next morning, the faint hum of the ocean mixing with the steady ticking of the clock. He went downstairs for coffee, but something stopped him midway through the hall. On the small table near the door sat a folded napkin, neatly pressed, with a single lemon resting on top. He frowned. It wasn't there last night. The doorbell rang again early, as always. Grace stood there, hair slightly tousled from the morning breeze, cheeks touched pink by the chill. Morning, she said with a polite nod, stepping in as though the house itself had been waiting for her. The faint scent of lemon followed. He watched as she filled a bucket, humming a tune he didn't recognize. Her hands moved with gentle precision, wringing a cloth, wiping the railings, straightening the pictures on the wall, the kind of care that felt personal, not paid for. After a while, Ethan asked, without looking up from his desk, Why do you keep coming early? I pay for 8 hours, not 9. Grace smiled, glancing over her shoulder. The house feels different in the morning, quieter, but not lonely yet. I like catching it before it remembers it's empty. He wasn't sure how to answer. You talk about houses like they're people. They are, sometimes, she said softly. They hold memories better than we do. She finished her sentence, but the words lingered in the air long after. Ethan turned a page of his report and found himself reading the same line again and again without seeing it. Later, she came into the study holding a tray with 2 cups. I made coffee, she said simply. He looked up sharply. That wasn't necessary. I figured it wouldn't hurt. She set the tray down on the table, waiting for his disapproval. But he only watched her hands, steady, unhurried. He noticed a faint scar across one knuckle, a pale mark against her skin. You hurt yourself? He asked before he could stop the words. Years ago, she said. Kitchen knife. Nothing tragic. Just a reminder to slow down. He nodded. The conversation felt strange, ordinary, almost human. The sort of talk he hadn't had in years. When she left that afternoon, the house didn't seem to exhale relief the way it used to. Instead, the air felt like it was holding its breath. Ethan walked into the kitchen and saw both cups still sitting on the table. She had left one for him. Steam had faded, but the scent remained, soft and citrus. He took a sip. It wasn't his usual roast lighter, sweeter somehow. Outside, the gray cat stretched under the window, basking in the sun that poured through the glass. The bay shimmered in the distance, waves brushing the shore in slow rhythm. He found himself thinking of her words again. Houses hold memories better than we do. For the first time in years, he wondered what memories his house was keeping safe for him. That evening, as dusk spread its blue light across the bay, Ethan stood by the window again. The stray cat curled on the rug. A lemon slice floated in the glass beside him, scenting the air like something alive. He stared out into the fading light, the water calm and endless, and realized he was waiting for something, though he didn't know what. That night, the house did not feel quite so quiet anymore. The next week arrived with the hum of summer rain over Charleston Bay. Gray clouds hung low above the water, and the air smelled faintly of salt and damp earth. Ethan sat at his desk, the same desk where he had spent years counting numbers, measuring worth in dollars and decimals. The reports in front of him blurred into meaningless lines. The storm outside drummed against the windows, a rhythm steadier than his thoughts. Grace had come that morning, as she always did, bringing the scent of lemon and something else, quiet resilience. She moved through the rooms, humming under her breath, the same tune she seemed to carry everywhere. Ethan caught himself listening for it whenever she passed. By late morning, he called her into the study. "Grace," he said, not looking up from his papers, "I need you to run an errand downtown. There's a letter that must be hand-delivered." She nodded. "Yes, sir." When she returned later, soaked from the rain, she set the envelope on his desk. "The office was closed," she said. "I slipped it under the door, but—" He raised an eyebrow. "But what?" She hesitated. "There was a man outside, sitting on the steps. Homeless, maybe. He asked for change. I didn't have any cash, so I gave him my lunch." Ethan looked up, startled. "You gave away your lunch?" "It was only a sandwich," she said simply. He looked hungrier than I felt. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You can't help everyone, Grace." "I know," she said, meeting his eyes. "But I can help someone." Her words landed softly, but stayed, like a stone, in still water. He turned back to his desk, pretending to read. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant. That afternoon, the rain eased into a mist. Grace continued her work in silence, but Ethan's concentration was gone. He found himself thinking of the man on the steps, of Grace standing there in the rain, handing over her lunch without hesitation. He wondered when he had stopped noticing people like that. He walked into the living room where she was dusting the piano that hadn't been played in years. "Why did you really give it to him?" he asked. Grace looked up, surprised. "Because I was there and he was hungry." "Eversakten." "That's not an answer." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe you're asking the wrong question." He frowned. "Meaning?" She set the cloth down. "Meaning some things don't have profit margins, Mr. Calloway. They just have heart." Ethan opened his mouth to respond but said nothing. For a moment, the rainlight caught the silver streaks in his hair, and he looked older, tired in a way numbers couldn't fix. Grace turned back to the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. A single note rang out, soft, hesitant, beautiful. "It's out of tune," she said. "So am I," he muttered before realizing he'd spoken aloud. Grace looked at him, her expression unreadable, then smiled, a slow, understanding smile that made something in his chest twist. She didn't reply, but the silence that followed was different now, filled with warmth instead of emptiness. By evening, the rain stopped. The house smelled of coffee and lemon again. On the desk lay a folded piece of paper he hadn't noticed before. His name was written neatly on the front, Mr. Calloway. He opened it. Inside, in Grace's handwriting, were only a few words. "Money measures what you have. Heart measures what you give." He stared at the note for a long time, longer than he intended. Then, almost without thinking, he reached for the photograph of his mother and turned it upright again. The clock ticked in the quiet. Somewhere outside, the bay answered with the soft slap of waves against the shore. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled just slightly, like a man remembering how. That night, the paper stayed on his desk, weighted by his pen, the ink still glimmering faintly under the lamplight. He didn't throw it away. The next morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of sunlight that turned the bay silver and the leaves into tiny mirrors. Ethan poured himself coffee, the sound of it echoing in the kitchen like company. He stood there for a moment, staring at the folded note still pinned under his pen on the table. He didn't know why he hadn't tossed it, perhaps because it felt like something alive, small proof that someone had looked at him, not as a machine, but as a man. When Grace arrived, she found him already downstairs. "Morning, Mr. Calloway," she said with that calm, steady tone of hers. "You're up early." "I had work," he said, then hesitated. "Coffee?" She blinked. "You're offering me coffee?" He cleared his throat. "It's just brewed. It would be wasteful to pour it out." She smiled, accepting the cup. "Well then, let's not waste a good morning." They sat at the kitchen table in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Through the open window came the sounds of Charleston waking up boats in the harbor, a child calling to her dog, the distant church bell striking 8. Grace took a small sip, then glanced at him. "You ever go into town, Mr. Calloway?" "Rarely. There's no reason." "There's always a reason," she said, looking out toward the bay. "Even if it's just to remember that the world's still spinning." He didn't reply. But something in him stirred a faint memory of market stalls and warm air from years ago, when his mother would drag him through the crowd, buying bread and laughing. He hadn't thought about that sound in years. Later that day, Grace asked if she could clean the storage room. He allowed it with a nod. Hours passed quietly until she called out, "Mr. Calloway, you might want to see this." He entered the room to find her holding a small wooden box, the lid open. Inside lay a collection of old coins, neatly arranged and polished with care. His father's collection. "I found it behind some books," she said. "You must have forgotten about it." He stared at the coins. "I didn't forget. I just stopped looking." She studied him for a moment, then asked softly, "Why?" "Because they belong to him," Ethan said. "He used to say money is what keeps people honest. I spent half my life proving him wrong." Grace closed the box carefully, her fingers brushing the wood. "Maybe it's not the money that's wrong," she said. "Maybe it's what we forget to do with it." Her words caught him off guard. He turned toward the window, watching the gulls sweep low over the bay. The water glittered like glass, clear, bright, and impossibly wide. That evening, when she left, the house didn't feel quite so vast. On his way back to the study, Ethan paused by the piano. A folded piece of paper rested there. It was a child's drawing, 2 stick figures standing by a big blue bay, one tall, one small, both smiling. At the bottom, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you for the sandwich. Tea." Oh, he didn't know how Grace had gotten it, or who the child was, but he stared at it for a long time. Then he placed the drawing next to his mother's photo. He poured himself another cup of coffee, sat back in his chair, and listened to the waves outside, the faint hum of the world he'd forgotten to hear. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't count the minutes, he just let them pass. That night, the clock ticked softly, and the note on his desk fluttered once in the ocean breeze coming through the open window. The morning sun drifted lazily over the bay, painting the kitchen walls with soft gold. Ethan Calloway stood by the counter, still in his pressed shirt and watch, staring at the skillet in front of him like it was a complicated negotiation. The smell of batter and butter filled the air, a smell he hadn't known in years. He'd found the old pan in the cupboard and, for reasons he couldn't explain, decided to try making breakfast himself. The first pancake burned, the second came out too pale. He was scraping the third from the pan when Grace appeared at the doorway, holding a folder and blinking in mild disbelief. "Well," she said, folding her arms, "this is new." Ethan gave her a look that was half stern, half sheepish. "I was experimenting." "With fire?" she teased, crossing the room. "You could have just called me." "I don't call people for pancakes," he muttered, but his tone lacked its usual bite. Grace smiled, tying her apron. "You should. Pancakes are sacred." She took the spatula from him and poured a smooth circle of batter. "The trick is not to fight it. Just wait for the bubbles. Patience, Mr. Calloway." He watched her work, how she moved with calm confidence, how her sleeves brushed the sunlight. The smell of butter mixed with lemon, faint but unmistakable. She flipped the pancake perfectly, landing it with a soft hiss on the skillet. Ethan found himself smiling before he caught it. "You make it look easy." "That's because it is," she said. You just have to stop trying so hard. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching as she plated the pancakes with slices of banana and a drizzle of syrup. She set a plate in front of him. Breakfast is served. He hesitated, fork in hand, then took a bite. Sweet, warm, imperfectly perfect. Grace poured coffee into 2 mugs, the kind of easy gesture that made the room feel smaller, closer. "This isn't part of your job description," he said. "Neither was feeding the cat," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "Yet here we are." Ethan gave a quiet chuckle, a sound that startled even him. Grace grinned. "Was that a laugh?" "I suppose," he said. "It's been a while." She studied him for a moment. "You should do that more often. You look 10 years younger when you smile." He looked down, embarrassed, but the warmth in his chest stayed. They ate in comfortable silence, the clinking of cutlery blending with the soft music Grace had put on her phone, a slow country tune about home, the kind of melody that wrapped itself around the morning. The cat stretched on the rug, purring. The clock in the hall ticked steady and slow. When they finished, Grace gathered the plates, humming again. Ethan listened to the sound as he sipped his coffee, letting it fill the space where silence used to live. "Do you play?" she asked suddenly, nodding toward the piano in the corner of the living room. "Not since I was a boy," he said. "You should," she told him. "The house would like that." He shook his head but didn't argue. As she wiped the counter, he noticed a small stain on her sleeve, a circle of syrup catching the light. "You've got," he gestured vaguely. She laughed, brushing at it. "Occupational hazard." For a moment, they simply stood there, smiling, the morning stretching gently between them. Outside, the bay shimmered like glass, and a soft breeze moved through the curtains. Ethan thought, almost absently, that the house had started to breathe again. That day, he didn't work. He took his coffee to the porch and sat in the sun, while Grace hummed in the kitchen, the rhythm of her voice steady and kind. The world felt lighter somehow, as though someone had opened a window inside his chest. By late morning, the house smelled of butter, maple, and sunshine. Grace moved through the kitchen like she belonged there, her humming rising and falling with the rhythm of small chores, washing, drying, folding. Ethan sat at the table, pretending to read the newspaper, though his eyes kept drifting toward her. She noticed and smiled. "You know, you don't have to hover like a teacher watching a student." He lowered the paper. "I'm making sure you don't burn the house down." "Right," she said, flipping a towel onto the counter. "Because the person who nearly set fire to the skillet last week should be on safety duty." He almost laughed again. "Point taken." The clock ticked in the background, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the bay shimmered under the noon light, and the cat dozed by the window, its tail twitching lazily. Grace poured them each another cup of coffee. The sound of it filled the quiet in a way Ethan found oddly comforting. "Do you ever take a break?" he asked. She looked up, considering. "Not really. My daughter used to say I only sit still when I'm asleep." He hesitated. "You have a daughter?" "Lila," she said, smiling softly. 6 years old. Talks too much, dreams even more. Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. "Must keep you busy." "She keeps me alive," Grace said simply, her voice light but steady. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to his coffee. "You could bring her here sometime," he said quietly. "If you ever need to." Grace blinked. "You mean bring her here? To work?" "Just for a day. I assume she's well behaved." "She's curious," Grace said with a grin. "Which is both good and dangerous." Ethan shrugged. "Curiosity isn't the worst thing." She tilted her head. "You sound like someone who used to know that." "Aye." Her words hit him in an unexpected place, somewhere between memory and regret. He thought of the old piano in the other room, of his mother's hands guiding his over the keys when he was a boy. He hadn't played since she died. Grace must have seen something change in his face because she said gently, "You should try again. Sometimes music reminds you of things you didn't know you'd forgotten." He stood, as if to shake off the thought. "That'll be all for today, Grace." She smiled knowingly but didn't push. "Of course, Mr. Calloway." When she left that afternoon, the house didn't fall back into silence. Her humming lingered in the air, soft as a thread running through the rooms. Ethan wandered into the living room. and stared at the piano. Dust had gathered on the lid. He brushed it away with his hand, revealing the smooth, dark wood beneath. He sat down, hesitating before pressing a single key. The sound was faint, slightly off tune, but real. It trembled in the air like the first breath of something waking after years of sleep. Outside, the bay caught the afternoon sun, and light spilled across the room. The clock ticked in rhythm with the piano note, steady and sure. He played one more key, then another. Slow, uneven, but alive. The melody came out broken and hesitant, but it filled the house with warmth. From somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt a laugh, rising small, quiet, but genuine. The sound echoed softly through the house. That evening, as the sky turned rose gold, the house glowed from within. The rhythm of the day lingered, like a heartbeat returning to a body that had almost forgotten how to feel. And in that moment, sitting at the piano with sunlight on his hands, Ethan Calloway finally understood. The heart doesn't stop, it just waits for the right song to start again. The following week arrived with a scent of salt and rain drifting through the open windows. Charleston was quieter than usual that morning. Boats rocked gently in the harbor, and a single heron stood still in the shallows. Ethan Calloway was in his study, staring at an old brass clock that hadn't ticked in over a decade. It sat on the corner of his desk, a relic from another life. He'd taken it out that morning without knowing why. Perhaps it was the echo of music still lingering in the house since the day he'd touched the piano again. Or maybe it was Grace's voice, her words about remembering what one had forgotten. Grace appeared at the door, wiping her hands on a towel. "You look like you're waiting for that thing to start talking," she said. He gave her a faint smile. "It used to. My father kept it by his bed. Said as long as it ticked, there was time to fix things." Grace approached, her eyes studying the clock. "And when it stopped?" "He didn't," Ethan said quietly. "He passed away that night." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of rain filled the silence. Then Grace reached for the clock, turning it gently in her hands. "Do you mind if I try?" He raised a brow. "You're not a clockmaker. Neither am I a miracle worker," she said lightly. "But sometimes things just need a little patience." She examined the gears, her brow furrowing in concentration. Then she pulled a hairpin from her pocket and adjusted one of the smaller cogs. There was a click, a fragile, uncertain sound, and then, faintly, a steady tick, tick, tick. Ethan's breath caught. The rhythm was soft, but alive. Grace smiled without looking up. "See? It just needed a little faith." He stared at the clock as though it had spoken. "You shouldn't have been able to fix that." "Maybe it didn't need fixing," she said. "Maybe it just needed to be noticed again." He couldn't think of an answer. His throat tightened with something that wasn't sadness exactly, but close. He stood abruptly, turning toward the window. The rain had eased, leaving a mist that shimmered over the bay. "Thank you," he murmured. Grace placed the clock back on the desk, its steady rhythm filling the silence. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank the time you still have." When she left the room, Ethan remained where he was, listening to the clock's heartbeat echo through the quiet. That evening, as the sky turned gray-blue, he wandered into the hallway and found himself standing before a framed photograph he hadn't looked at in years. It was of him and his father, two men in suits, the older one smiling faintly, the younger one trying to. He touched the edge of the frame, then turned toward the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Grace was humming again, a tune light and old-fashioned. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel the urge to tell her to lower her voice. He let the music blend with the ticking clock behind him. The sound was imperfect, yet together, they made something that almost felt like life coming back. That night, the storm returned. Rain drummed against the tall windows, and the sea wind rattled the shutters. Ethan couldn't sleep. He found himself wandering down the hallway, barefoot, drawn by the faint ticking that echoed from his study. The brass clock sat where Grace had left it, steady and alive, casting a small reflection in the lamplight. He sat before it, hands clasped, watching the second hand move slow, patient, unstoppable. He thought of his father, of all the things left unsaid between them. The years had hardened him into someone who believed emotions were liabilities. His father had taught him to build walls. Grace, somehow, had started tearing them down without even trying. He rubbed his face and leaned back in the chair. "What would you think of me now, old man?" he murmured. "You'd probably say I've gone soft." A soft voice answered from the doorway. "Or maybe you've gone human." Grace stood there, her robe tied loosely, eyes tired but kind. "I heard movement," she said quietly. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." He nodded toward the clock. "It's working again. I didn't think it ever would." Grace stepped closer, her gaze following the gentle swing of the pendulum. "Funny thing about time," she said. "It doesn't stop when we want it to. It just waits for us to catch up." Ethan looked at her, the faint golden light tracing her face. "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Keep believing that broken things can work again," she smiled sadly. "Because I was one of them once." The words hung between them, soft as the ticking clock. Ethan wanted to ask more but didn't. He could tell she wouldn't answer tonight. Instead, they stood there together in silence, two people listening to the rhythm of something that had outlasted pain. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the room, warm and forgiving. Grace arrived early again, her usual basket of lemons in hand. She paused when she saw him already in the kitchen, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "You're early," she said. "I figured if I'm awake, I might as well make coffee," he replied. She laughed, taking the mug from him. "Careful, or I'll start thinking you're becoming human for real." "Don't get used to it," he said. But his smile betrayed him. They drank their coffee in companionable quiet. The clock ticked softly from the other room, the sound now a part of the house, part of their mornings. As Grace wiped down the counter, she noticed a slip of paper pinned to the fridge. It was a hand-drawn schedule in Ethan's sharp handwriting. Tuesday, maintenance day. Wednesday, garden check. Thursday, Grace's daughter visit. Approved. She looked up, eyes wide. "You mean it?" He nodded, trying not to look sentimental. "You said she's curious. Let her see the ocean. It's good for curious people." Grace's voice softened. "You have no idea what this means to her." He gave her a half smile. "I think I'm starting to." The bay shimmered outside, the tide pulling softly against the shore. The old clock chimed the hour, its sound bright and full. Grace leaned on the counter watching him. "You're changing, Mr. Calloway." He met her gaze. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just remembering." The light from the window fell across them, warm and unhurried. Somewhere in that moment between the sound of the clock, the laughter from the harbor, and the smell of fresh coffee, the mansion that had once been silent finally began to feel like home again. Saturday morning arrived with sunlight spilling through the curtains, sharp and golden after 2 days of rain. Ethan Calloway stood on the front porch, hands in his pockets, watching the bay sparkle like glass. He hadn't felt nervous in years, but today was different. Today, Grace's daughter was coming. Inside, Grace moved quickly through the house, checking every corner twice. "You don't have to make it perfect," Ethan said from the doorway. She glanced up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You say that because you've never seen a 6-year-old's eyes. They notice everything." He smiled faintly. "Noted." When the doorbell rang, Grace's face lit up. She hurried to open it, and a small girl with chestnut curls and a bright pink jacket stepped inside, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Hi," she said shyly. "I'm Lila." Ethan crouched a little to meet her gaze. "Hi, Lila. I'm Mr. Calloway." She tilted her head. "You look like someone who drinks too much coffee." Grace gasped, mortified. "Lila." Ethan laughed a soft, genuine sound that surprised them both. "That's probably fair." The girl giggled, and in that instant, something shifted in the air. The mansion, once cold and distant, filled with a warmth no fireplace could match. Lila wandered through the rooms like a small explorer, her shoes tapping softly against the marble floors. "It's so big," she whispered. "Does it echo?" She cupped her hands and shouted, "Hello!" The word bounced faintly off the walls. "It does!" Grace sighed, but Ethan smiled.
"Let her explore. The house could use some noise."
In the kitchen, Lila discovered the jar of lemons Grace always kept on the counter. Why do you have so many? She asked, eyes wide. They make things smell nice, Grace said. They make things sour, Ethan corrected. Lila giggled.
So you're both right.
And she found the piano next and ran her fingers across the keys, each note soft and curious. It sounds sleepy, she said. Ethan stepped closer. It hasn't been played much. Lila looked up. Then wake it up. Her words were so simple, so matter-of-fact, that Ethan didn't know what to say. Grace gave him a look gentle, but urging. Go on. He sat down, fingers hovering over the keys. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old brass clock. Then, slowly, he began to play. It was clumsy at first, the notes uneven, but Lila's small hands clapped with delight. That's pretty, she said. He kept going, the melody finding its rhythm, soft and trembling but alive. Grace stood behind him, her hand resting over her heart. When he finished, Lila whispered, It doesn't sound sleepy anymore. Ethan looked at her and smiled. No, I suppose it doesn't. The rest of the morning passed easily, pancakes, laughter, and sunlight spilling over the table. Lila talked endlessly about her school, her drawings, her imaginary friend named Daisy who lived in a treehouse. Ethan listened, genuinely listened, for the first time in years. At one point, Grace caught him smiling and said, You look like you belong in this picture. He didn't answer, but his eyes softened. After lunch, Lila explored the garden, running between the hydrangeas and the lemon trees. The sound of her laughter floated through the open windows, bright and effortless. Ethan stood beside Grace on the porch. You raise her well, he said quietly. She teaches me more than I teach her, Grace replied. Children usually do. He nodded, his gaze distant on the water. She reminds me of something I used to believe in. Grace looked at him curiously. What's that? He smiled faintly. That people can start over. A moment passed, filled with the sound of waves and wind. Then, from the garden, Lila called, Mr. Calloway, come see this! Oh? He hesitated, but Grace nudged him gently. Go on. She's not used to taking no for an answer. He walked down the steps toward the laughter, toward something new, something fragile, something that felt like hope. Ethan followed the sound of laughter through the garden path lined with camellias and lemon trees. Lila was crouched by a patch of flowers near the stone wall, her little hands busy arranging petals in a circle. When she saw him, she beamed. Look, it's a sun that fell on the ground. He crouched beside her. The petals, white, yellow, pink, radiated around a pebble in the middle. That's impressive, he said. You made this? She nodded proudly. Mom says every flower deserves to be noticed. Ethan glanced toward Grace, who stood on the porch smiling softly. She's right, he said, his voice low. Most of the time we walk too fast to see the good things. Lila looked up at him, her green eyes so much like her mother's. Do you walk too fast, Mr. Calloway? The question caught him off guard. I used to, he said, but maybe not anymore. She considered that, then grinned. Good. Fast walkers miss the magic. He chuckled. And what kind of magic is this? The kind you can't buy, she said matter-of-factly, standing up and brushing off her hands. Ethan blinked, stunned by the simplicity of her answer. He followed her gaze toward the sky, where the sun broke through the clouds, scattering light over the bay. They spent the afternoon by the water's edge, collecting seashells and watching boats drift past. Lila insisted on giving names to the shells, Harold, Daisy, and Captain Lemon. Ethan played along, writing their names in the sand. Grace joined them later, carrying a basket with sandwiches and lemonade. Careful, she said, laughing, as Lila splashed too close to the tide. Ethan caught the girl by the hand before the wave reached her. Easy there, he said. The sea's friendly, but it likes to test your balance. Lila giggled. So do I. Grace shook her head. She's exactly like her father, she murmured. Ethan looked at her. He's not around? Grace's smile dimmed slightly. No. He left before Lila was born. Said he wasn't ready for this kind of life. She waved a hand at the world around them. I stopped waiting for him to be. Ethan didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. His loss, he said simply. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. They watched the tide come in, and Lila drew little hearts in the wet sand. One of them surrounded all three of their names. When it was time to leave, Grace packed their things. Lila ran back toward the house and stopped in front of Ethan. "Here," she said, handing him a small seashell. "It's for you, so you don't forget to listen to the ocean." He took it carefully, feeling its cool surface. "Thank you, Lila." "I won't." She threw her arms around him in a quick, spontaneous hug. It was brief, but it left him frozen, caught between surprise and something that felt dangerously close to joy. After they drove away, Ethan stayed on the porch, the shell still in his hand. The sun was setting over the bay, turning the water into gold. The house behind him was quiet again, but not empty. He placed the shell beside the ticking clock on his desk. The two sounds, the faint hum of the sea and the steady rhythm of time, seemed to merge into one. That night, as he sat by the piano, he found himself playing without thinking, notes soft as a whisper, warm as a memory. And somewhere between melody and silence, he realized he wasn't playing for himself anymore. He was playing for them, for the laughter, the light, and the small hand that had reminded him how to feel again. The song lingered in the air long after the keys went, still gentle, unfinished, and alive. The next week brought a change in the air. Charleston buzzed under a bright sky, but inside Ethan Calloway's world, clouds were beginning to form. The photograph had appeared out of nowhere, printed on glossy paper, folded into an envelope left at his office. It showed him sitting on the park grass beside Grace and Lila, both smiling, sunlight spilling over them like an unguarded secret. Beneath the picture was a single line: "The billionaire and his maid." He stared at it for a long time, a muscle tightening in his jaw. Later that morning, his assistant brought in a stack of newspapers. "Sir, the photo's gone public." The headline stared back at him. "The reclusive Calloway secret family?" His chest went cold. "Who leaked it?" "No one knows. It's spreading fast." He dismissed the assistant and sat alone in his office, the hum of the city distant beneath the pounding in his ears. For the first time in years, the control he built his life upon began to crack. When he returned home, Grace was already waiting by the door. She looked pale, a folded newspaper trembling slightly in her hands. "You've seen it?" she asked. He nodded once. "Yes." Her voice was low but steady. "I never wanted this to happen. Lila and we didn't mean to cause trouble." "Oh," Ethan set his briefcase down. "You didn't, but people will think—" "They already do," he interrupted. "And they'll keep thinking whatever sells the most papers." She exhaled shakily. "Then maybe we should go, just until this fades." He looked at her sharply. "No." "Ethan." "I said no." His tone was sharper than he intended, the old businessman's edge slipping through. Grace flinched. He caught himself, softening his voice. "Please, don't leave." "Oh." For a moment, silence filled the space between them, the kind that holds both fear and something deeper. Grace set the paper down on the table. "You don't owe us anything." "This isn't about owing," he said quietly. "It's about what's right." She met his eyes, confusion and gratitude warring inside her. "People are cruel. They'll twist everything." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let them talk. I've been called worse things than kind." Him. Outside, the bay was calm, the waves gentle and relentless. Grace turned toward the window, her reflection shimmering beside his in the glass. "You're not afraid of losing your reputation?" Ethan's voice came out steady. "I lost more important things long before this." Her eyes softened. "And what did you lose?" He paused. "Time, trust, people who cared before I knew how to deserve them." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Grace nodded slowly. "Then maybe this is your chance to get some of that back." That night, after she and Lila had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone at the piano. The photograph lay beside the ticking brass clock, its edges curling in the lamplight. He stared at it, at the laughter frozen in that perfect afternoon, and realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't angry about being misunderstood. He was only afraid of losing the very thing the world was mocking him for having. He pressed his fingers to the keys, playing softly into the dark, each note carrying the weight of both fear and something like hope. Morning came heavy with silence. The sun rose over Charleston, but its light felt distant through the haze of gossip. Every newsstand on King Street had his face on the cover. Ethan Calloway, the Ice King melts. Some headlines were cruel, others curious. None of them told the truth. Grace arrived later than usual. Her eyes were red from a sleepless night, and Lila wasn't with her. "I left her with my neighbor," she said quietly. "I didn't want her to hear people talking." Ethan gestured for her to sit, but she shook her head. "We can't stay here, Ethan. It's not right. You don't need this chaos." He leaned against the table, hands steady, even though his heart wasn't. "You think I care what strangers say? You should," she said softly. "You've built a life around being untouchable. Now they'll say you're reckless." He gave a dry laugh. "Reckless for what, smiling? For caring?" Grace looked down, her fingers twisting the strap of her bag. "They'll hurt you for it. They'll say things about me, about Lila. They already have." He took a slow step forward. "Grace, listen to me. I've lived half my life behind walls built to keep people out. You and your daughter walked in without asking permission, and for the first time, it felt like those walls were worth tearing down. Her voice trembled. "And what if those walls fall on us? Then I'll be the one holding them up," he said quietly. The room went still. Outside, the tide rolled against the dock, steady and unbothered by the storms of men. Grace finally met his eyes, tears glimmering. "You really mean that?" He nodded. Every word. There was a knock at the door. His assistant stood there, pale and uneasy. "Sir, the board is requesting a meeting. They're concerned about the company's image." End of 12. Ethan's tone was calm, even kind. "Tell them, I'll handle it personally." When the door closed again, he turned back to Grace. "Stay," he said. "Not because I asked, because you want to." She hesitated, the storm in her expression softening into something like peace. "All right," she whispered. That afternoon, Ethan faced the board. The room was sharp with suits, the air full of judgment. One man slid a paper across the table, the headline photo of Ethan and Grace. "This is spreading. We need a statement, perhaps a denial." Ethan looked around the table, his voice steady. "No denial. She's an honest woman. She and her child have done nothing wrong. If anyone here has a problem with kindness, there's the door." The silence was electric. A few men shifted uncomfortably. No one stood to leave. When he returned home, the house was quiet except for the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Grace looked up when he entered, searching his face for an answer. "They won't bother us anymore," he said simply. Her eyes widened. "What did you do?" "Something I should have done a long time ago," he replied. "I told the truth." She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what truth is that?" He met her gaze. "That you reminded me what life's supposed to feel like." She didn't answer, just looked at him with that mix of disbelief and warmth he'd grown to recognize. Outside, the evening wind swept across the bay, carrying with it the scent of salt and magnolia. The old clock chimed softly from the study, each note marking a new beginning. For the first time, Ethan didn't hear it as a reminder of time lost, only as proof that time still moved forward. He turned toward Grace and said quietly, "Tomorrow, we'll go out. All of us. Let them see what a family looks like when it stops hiding." She nodded, her eyes shining, and for a fleeting moment, with the light of dusk settling over the water, the mansion that once belonged to a lonely man felt entirely alive. Charleston glowed beneath the golden haze of early autumn. The harbor breeze carried the scent of roasted pecans and distant music from the annual Harvest Festival downtown. It was the kind of night made for lanterns, laughter, and second chances. Ethan Calloway stood before his mirror, adjusting his jacket. For the first time in years, he wasn't dressing for investors or press conferences. He was dressing for something that mattered. On the dresser beside him lay the seashell Lila had given him, polished smooth by his thumb. He slipped it into his pocket like a quiet promise. Downstairs, Grace was helping Lila button her cardigan. The little girl twirled in her blue dress, giggling. "Mom, do I look like a fairy?" Grace smiled. "You look like magic, baby." Ethan paused at the bottom of the stairs, the sight of them stopping him mid-step. He cleared his throat gently. "Shall we?" Lila ran up to him and grabbed his hand. "You're coming too?" He smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." The three of them walked together through the lamplit streets, the festival lights reflecting on the water, Music drifted through the air fiddles, laughter, the rhythm of people who still believed in joy. Vendors lined the square with tables of pies, pumpkins, and handmade crafts. Grace stopped to admire a stand of wind chimes shaped like stars. "My mother used to make these," she said softly. Ethan reached up, letting one chime brush against his fingers. "Then you should have one." She shook her head. "They're not for me." He turned to the vendor. "How much for all of them?" The woman blinked. "All?" He nodded. "Everyone." Grace looked at him, half amused, half exasperated. "Ethan?" He handed the vendor his card. "Hang them around the square. Let everyone have a little music tonight." The vendor smiled, eyes wide. "That's mighty generous of you, sir." Ethan shrugged. "It's not generosity. It's a good sound." As they walked away, the wind picked up, and hundreds of chimes began to sing softly above the crowd. Grace stopped, listening. "You just bought the sky a melody," she whispered. He smiled faintly. Maybe it was owed one. Lila tugged at his hand. "Come on, Mr. Calloway. There's dancing." In the town square, couples twirled under strings of lights. Grace hesitated, but Lila was already pulling her toward the music. "Dance with us," she said, her laughter bright as the chimes overhead. Ethan froze for a second. Dancing wasn't something he did. It wasn't part of the man he used to be. But Grace looked back at him, her hand outstretched. "Come on, the world's watching anyway." He laughed softly and took her hand. The crowd spun around them, lanterns flickering like fireflies. Grace's hand was warm in his. Her smile was unguarded and real. As they moved together beneath the lights, something inside Ethan cracked open. The years of solitude, guilt, and silence, the weight of his own walls seemed to lift with every turn. Grace leaned in just enough to whisper, "See? Not so hard." He looked down at her, voice low. "You make it easy." When the song ended, applause echoed through the square. Lila clapped wildly, running to them. "You did it! You both danced!" Grace laughed, breathless. "Your turn, little one." Ethan scooped Lila up, spinning her once. Her laughter burst into the air, high and pure. In that moment, under the autumn lights, with chimes singing and laughter rising like wind over water, Ethan felt something he hadn't known in years. He felt home. But as the music faded, a shadow fell across the square. A familiar voice, sharp and cold, broke the spell. "Well," it said, "the rumors were true." Ethan turned. Standing at the edge of the crowd was Harold Denton, his former partner, the man who had once helped him build his empire and nearly destroyed it in the same breath. Grace's smile vanished. Lila clutched her mother's hand. Denton smirked. "You've changed, Calloway. I'll give you that. Didn't think you had it in you to play the family man." Ethan stepped forward, calm but firm. "You don't belong here, Harold." "Oh, neither do you," Denton said. "Not in this world of small people and cheap festivals. You built something bigger than this. Don't throw it away for pity." Ethan's gaze hardened. "I built it with the wrong purpose. And for the wrong people," Denton scoffed. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Ethan said quietly. "But I'd rather regret kindness than remember cruelty." Denton's expression flickered. Then he turned and vanished into the crowd. Grace's hand brushed Ethan's arm. "You didn't have to say that." He exhaled slowly. "Yes, I did." Above them, the chimes rang louder, as though the wind itself was applauding. The festival light shimmered against Grace's eyes, and for a long moment, the noise of the world faded into stillness, just three people standing in the glow of something true, fragile, and worth fighting for. The crowd slowly drifted back into the rhythm of laughter and music. The tension that Harold Denton's words had brought began to melt away under the glow of lantern light. Grace placed a gentle hand on Ethan's sleeve. "You handled that better than most men would," she said quietly. He let out a breath, the edges of his voice still rough. "I used to think silence was strength, but sometimes saying the truth out loud is the only way to stop living in shadows." They walked together toward the harbor, away from the noise of the festival. The bay shimmered under the moonlight, dotted with the reflections of the chimes he had bought earlier, tiny sparks of sound dancing with the tide. Lila ran ahead, chasing her reflection across the dock's planks, her laughter echoing through the night air. Grace watched her daughter, then turned back to Ethan. She hasn't laughed like that in a long time. Neither have I, he said softly. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of cinnamon and salt water. Grace smiled faintly. You know, I think she's changed you. He nodded, watching the little girl's silhouette against the water. She reminded me what it means to feel alive. You both did. They reached the end of the dock, where a small bench overlooked the harbor. Ethan sat down, the creak of old wood beneath him. Grace joined him, their shoulders almost touching. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked. Every day, he admitted. But for the first time, I'm not afraid of it. She studied him in the moonlight. You were afraid before? Of everything, he said simply. Of losing control, of being seen as weak, of caring about people who might walk away. And now, he looked out over the water, where the lights of the city flickered like stars. Now I think walking alone was the real weakness. Grace's eyes softened. You're learning faster than most, he smiled faintly. Good teacher. Lila came running back, holding something small in her hand. Look, I found a heart-shaped shell. She placed it in Ethan's palm, proud as if she'd discovered treasure. He turned it over gently. It's beautiful. It's for you, she said, climbing onto the bench between them. So you don't forget tonight. Grace wrapped an arm around her daughter, and for a while, the three of them sat there in silence, watching the tide pull softly against the dock. The chimes from town carried faintly on the breeze, their sound mingling with the laughter of strangers and the whisper of water against wood. When the first fireworks began to bloom over the harbor, Lila gasped, pointing to the sky. Bursts of gold and silver reflected in her wide eyes. It's like the stars came closer, she whispered. Ethan smiled, his voice warm. Maybe they did. Grace looked at him, her expression full of something tender and unspoken. You're not the same man I met a few months ago. He turned toward her. I don't think I ever really was. I just needed a reason to remember who I wanted to be. The fireworks flared again, their light brushing across his face, revealing something gentle that had been missing for years. Grace reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. They sat like that until the last spark faded, until the music turned to distant echoes, and the night grew still again. When they walked back toward the car, Lila asleep in her mother's arms, Ethan paused for one last look at the glowing bay. The wind chimes sang faintly, the same tune he'd played on the piano the night he thought he was alone. Grace glanced over her shoulder. What is it? He smiled softly. Just listening. To what? He looked toward the horizon, where the dark met the light. To time finally moving forward. I'm saying, as they disappeared down the quiet street, the chimes carried on behind them, gentle, patient, full of hope. And in the mansion by the bay, the brass clock ticked steadily through the night, marking not the end of a story, but the beginning of a life rediscovered. As the night settled softly over Charleston Bay, Ethan sat on the porch with Grace and little Lila, listening to the wind chimes sing above the quiet water. The old clock ticked gently inside, marking not the passing of time, but the beginning of a new one. After years of silence, he had found peace, not in wealth, but in the warmth of laughter, forgiveness, and family. This story reminds us that love and redemption can bloom at any age, and kindness, like a porch light glowing through the night, can guide us home even after we've lost our way. Sometimes, happiness begins with something as simple as sharing a meal, saying sorry, or holding someone's hand just a little longer. Take a moment tonight to think about the people who make your world brighter. If this story touched your heart, comment 1. If not, press 0 and share your thoughts. And if you believe in stories that heal and connect us, stay with us for more heartwarming stories like this one.